You were never the problem. And that is what made them so uneasy that they had to build an entire story to hide the truth that followed them like a shadow. When you look back on the years you were called names that never belonged to you, you will see one thing clearly, something no one dared to say before. They were not afraid of your mistakes. They were afraid of the freedom you carried. That freedom was not loud, not showy. It simply stood there like a mirror that forced anyone who looked into it to face themselves. And when a soul that belongs to no one appears, those who are used to holding the strings begin to tremble because they realize their power is more fragile than they believed. That trembling did not begin with shouting or arguments. It began the moment you decided not to bow your head as they expected. People can endure many things, but they struggle to endure a silence that no longer obeys. You might not have noticed it at the time, but that was the moment every mask began to crack. When you stood tall, they wavered. When you stayed silent, they grew frantic. When you stepped out of the corner, they built for you. The truth was forced to reveal itself. Those who shouted the loudest were often the ones most afraid to face who they really were. Psalm 25 verse 14 once said that the Lord reveals his covenant to those who fear him. That verse has followed you through many seasons of life, even when you did not know how to name it. For a soul that lives in integrity carries a light that shines upon its own path, and that light needs no spotlight. It only needs truth. That truth is not always comfortable, especially when it overturns things others have declared about you for far too long. But light does not ask if darkness wants to leave. It simply appears and exposes what has always been there. Many times they called you a troublemaker, someone who lacked sense, someone who complicated everything, but you knew those words were never yours to carry. What made everything heavy was not your presence, but their fear when they realized they could not shape you into what they wanted. You were not born to fit into a mold someone built for their own safety. And when you no longer shrank yourself to fit them, they called you the problem, even though they were the ones unable to live honestly. You carry something not everyone understands, a freedom that needs no permission. That freedom is not rebellion and it is not pride. It is simply the voice of a soul unwilling to live inside fabricated stories. You were not born to perform, but they survived on performances. When you stepped out of the script they wrote, they had no idea what to do with the space you left behind. The truth is, they were never afraid of your anger. They were afraid of your awakening. There are people who live their entire lives in the shadows of fake power. They are only strong when others are weak. They are only tall when others bow. They are only right when someone agrees to stay silent. And when you stopped playing the role of the one who endures, the walls they built around their authority began to crumble. Not because you attacked them, but because you no longer attacked yourself to make them comfortable. Truth has its own way of entering locked places, and the truth about you frightened them because it no longer served the story they wanted to tell. In the quiet days when you wondered why they treated you that way, you began to see more clearly. The eyes that once looked down on you suddenly wavered. The accusations that once cut like blades became hollow echoes, not because they had changed, but because they no longer held what they once used to bind you, your doubt in yourself. When you understood your worth, they lost the only anchor they had for their control. They called you the problem only so they would not have to admit they failed to control a free soul. When truth stands before them, they do not know where to look. The stories they built about you wear thin with time. The more they try to force you back into the frame they created, the more their smallness becomes impossible to hide. And that smallness makes them angry, makes them uneasy, makes them search for every excuse to put the blame on you. But the more they blame, the more clearly it shows they cannot control their own selves. You were never the fire that burned their peace. You were the mirror that showed them the truth they avoided all their lives. There were moments on this journey when you thought you were weak, but that weakness did not belong to you. It was the reflex of a soul carrying labels that were never its own. You are stronger than you think, and they knew it long before you did. That is why they tried so hard to make you believe the opposite. A soul unaware of its strength is easy to control, but a soul awakened cannot be shaken by any false power. Truth is unlocking the doors you once feared. It does not ask you to shout. It does not demand you to prove anything. It only asks you to keep standing in your own light. You are not the problem. You are the invitation for them to face themselves. And for those who worship power, that is a fear greater than any enemy outside. Truth never stands alone. It carries the echo of history, as if all of humanity has witnessed what you have just lived through. Every empire that once stood in arrogance collapsed not because of the roar of the crowds, but because someone, a soul like you, decided not to kneel anymore. A small action, quiet as a breath, yet strong enough to make ancient walls crack from within. No flags, no swords, only one person standing tall on a land used to bowing, and everything changed. You are not the exception. You are the continuation of that law. History does not write this in fancy words. It records it through the simplest moments. A slave refusing the whip, a woman refusing silence, an ordinary person refusing to betray their conscience. And in every one of those moments lived the same thing that has lived in you, a freedom that cannot be suppressed. No one taught you that. No one passed it down to you. It was planted in you from the beginning, like a seed of steadfastness that no force can tear out. When you stand for truth, you are not only yourself, you become the voice of countless souls who walked before you. Those who understood that freedom does not need violence to speak. When you look back on your journey, you will see this law woven through every detail. Why did they panic when you set a small boundary? Why did they tremble when you stayed calm? Because they were not afraid of the boundary. They were afraid of what the boundary revealed, that their control had never been real. When you stopped obeying, they had to face the emptiness they had been hiding behind their loud words. And for those who survive on false power, that fear is greater than any rebellion. There were people who thought they had power over you simply because you stayed silent. They built a whole world where you were the small one, the one who needed to be taught, the one who had to know your place. But when truth began to rise, your silence became a light shining straight into those fragile structures. They were not prepared for that moment because they always believed you would stay inside the role they assigned you. A free soul is something they never planned for. And when freedom walks into a room, everything built on control turns to ash, no matter how tightly they try to hold on. That is when Psalm 37 verse 4 echoes, like a quiet reminder you once heard many times, without naming it. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. This verse speaks not only of desires, but of the alignment between a soul and truth. When you choose to stand in the light, you do not ask anyone for permission. You do not wait for approval. You simply return to where you belong. And when truth is the foundation, everything else finds its way. You do not need to fight for freedom. Freedom already belonged to you the moment you stopped giving it away. In the moments when they tried to twist the story, you began to see the repetition of history. People often call the free ones rebels, not because they have done wrong, but because their freedom exposes the spiritual dependence of those around them. When you are no longer subdued, they must face the question they have run from all their lives. Who are they when there is no one left to command? And when they have no answer, they turn you into the problem so they will not have to face themselves. But false power has no roots. It survives on the fear others hand to it. When you withdraw that fear, it loses its foundation. That is why you only need to stand tall to throw their world into chaos. Truth does not need to shout. It only needs to exist. People can close their ears to truth, but they cannot silence it. They can cover it up, distort it, twist it, but when you walk out of the story they created, truth follows you into the open. What unsettles them is not your strength, but your awakening. Their whole world is a wide stage where every character is placed in a spot that keeps them at the center, but you quietly stepped off that stage. Not because you wanted to fight, but because you no longer wanted to perform. And when your role disappeared, the entire play lost its anchor. The lines they once used to define you became meaningless when you no longer took part in the script. When the light of truth shines on the stage, people can finally see what is acting and what is real. Empires collapse not because they lack supporters, but because no one believes their story anymore. The same thing happened in your life. When people looked closer, when they observed your calm next to the chaos of their accusations, they saw what noise had once hidden, that you were never the problem. You were simply truth standing still in a room full of illusions, and truth, even silent, is stronger than any excuse they tried to build. History always leans toward freedom, even when freedom walks alone, and you, even in the moments you thought you were alone, have never walked alone. Truth walks with you. Light walks with you. The souls who once stood tall before injustice walk with you. When you dare to step out of the darkness others built, you become the evidence of what history has whispered again and again. A free person can bring down an entire system built on control. You are not fighting them, you simply stopped fighting yourself. And that is what frightens them. Truth has begun its journey. It moves with you through every accusation, every loud voice, every twisted story. You are not the problem. You are the light they cannot control. Nothing frightens them more than the moment you rise and speak one simple word that is stronger than any argument. No. That word, small as it seems, echoes into the dark corners they have hidden for so long. Not because you refused something grand, but because they were never prepared for the idea that you have the right to choose. They once built an entire world where you were easy to control, where you always nodded, where you always stepped back so they could step forward. And with just one moment when you no longer stepped back, everything they built began to shake like an old roof in strong wind. They call your boundary rebellion, but beneath that anger is the fear of being exposed. Because once you set a boundary, they must face the truth that their power was never real. It was only the permission you once gave them. When that permission vanished, they lost their breath, lost their grip, lost the role they believed belonged to them. You did not hurt them. You only returned them to themselves. And that made them tremble because they had lived too long relying on the obedience of others. Your boundary is not a wall to shut people out, but a door that opens into the self-respect you once forgot to give yourself. It is not war. It is not defiance. It is simply a reminder that you have a soul, a worth, and the right to keep your peace whole. But for those who only know how to love through control, any act of self-protection becomes an accusation. You are only protecting your peace, yet they believe you are declaring war, because in the eyes of those who crave ownership, independence is always a threat. As that quiet confrontation unfolds, a verse from Psalm 18 verse 2 rises like the strong breath you once needed to hear. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. This truth does not arrive as a religious lesson, but as a heartbeat, reminding you that you do not need permission to stand firm. You do not need to explain yourself to protect your peace. Every soul that knows the path back to truth carries a refuge no one else can touch. And because you have that refuge, they can no longer hold the control they once thought was secure. Your boundary throws them into chaos in ways unseen, but felt in every breath. Why do they grow angry when you only ask for space? Why do they call you selfish when you only want to live honestly? Why does your silence unsettle them? Because a person addicted to power cannot stand it when you no longer step into their emotional games. They want you to react, to explain, to kneel and apologize. But when you do nothing, they are forced to face the truth that their power never reached the core of who you are. More than once, you wondered if setting a boundary was too harsh, if you should try a little harder to avoid hurting anyone. But the truth is, you did not cause pain. You only stopped hurting yourself. And when you stopped, those who benefited from your sacrifice began to lose their footing. They did not know what new label to place on you. They called you cold, ungrateful, distant. In reality, they were only afraid that you were no longer the emotional object they could shape at will. In those days, you learned something you had never dared to believe. Your peace is not a bargaining chip. It is not a gift someone has the right to take whenever they choose. It is the indivisible part of your soul, and anyone who loves you truly will honor it, not demand that you sacrifice it just to keep them close. Those who grow angry because you protect yourself never wanted you. They only wanted their authority over you. When this truth settles in, you begin to see the shift in the eyes of those who watch from the outside. They no longer believe the story that you are the problem. They see that your calm is not resistance. They see that your boundary is not rebellion. They see that the anger of the controlling person does not come from any real wound, but from the loss of power. And as that light spreads, the accusations fall like dry leaves, unable to cling to anyone anymore. In this flow, if anyone hearing these words feels something familiar stir in their soul, leave a message, not to support anyone, but to remind yourself that awakening is not a path many can walk alone. One small voice can open a great door. One shared moment can break the loneliness that controlling people want you to believe is real. Connection has never been a luxury. It is proof that you are not alone on your journey. When boundaries become a natural breath, you realize you no longer tremble at someone else's anger. You no longer fear loss, because the only thing you lose is the invisible chain that held you at their feet for too long. You no longer fear being misunderstood, because truth does not need understanding to be truth. You simply keep walking, and with each step, the stories they placed on you fall away like years of dust on a mirror. And in this new steadiness, you finally understand what you once had no words for. Boundaries do not separate you from real love. They separate you from bondage. Those who cannot stand your boundaries are those who cannot stand your growth. But those who belong to the light will see your boundaries as wisdom, not defiance. You set a boundary, and their old world collapsed. Not because you destroyed it, but because it had been cracked for a long time. You simply refused to remain the brick that held it up. And from that moment on, everything became clear. You are not the problem. You are the truth that no longer asks for permission to exist. There are days when you wonder why the love they gave you was so fragile, why it cracked like old glass the moment you tried to stand a little straighter. But then the truth appears clearer than ever. That love was never love at all. It was a rope wrapped in sweet words to make you believe you were kept because of your worth, when in reality you were kept because of convenience. Because if that love had truly been love, it would not have changed its tone every time you stopped obeying. It would not have grown cold the moment you became too free to be led. It would not have disappeared at the exact moment you needed support the most. The truth is, they never wanted to love you. They wanted to own you. They wanted you to warm the room they built from their own insecurity. They wanted you to reflect the image they painted, so they would not have to face the emptiness inside. All the smiles that once softened your heart, all the gentle words that made you believe you were cared for, became rewards for your obedience. A kind of love you had to pay for with your silence, with shrinking yourself so no one would be uncomfortable. When affection becomes a transaction, you no longer feel safe. You begin to enter rooms with your chest tight, your mind guessing which role they want you to play today. You do not dare speak too loud, breathe too deeply from them, or show too much joy or sorrow. Every emotion must pass through an invisible filter. Will this make them leave? Will this disappoint them? Will this make them angry? And while you try to keep them whole, you break apart piece by piece. But one day, when you stop and look at your own exhaustion, something in you rises like a flame that has been smothered too long, no longer willing to be pressed down. You begin to see the moments you once accepted simply because you believed they were the best you could receive. You realize you have lived inside rooms locked by someone else's hesitation. You realize you called their limitations love because you feared that if you did not, there would be nothing left to hold on to. And when the light of truth begins to slip into those corners, Psalm 145, verse 18, appears like warm breath inside you. The Lord is near to all who call on him. This verse does not come to comfort you by saying everything will be fine. It comes to remind you that real love never requires you to shrink to survive. Real love never makes you lose your voice. Real love never turns you into an accessory meant to fill someone else's emptiness. Real love comes close without controlling. It lifts rather than weighs down. It frees rather than tightens. And when that truth touches the deepest part of your soul, you understand you never loved wrong. You only gave your heart to people who did not know what to do with a gift, except hold it as proof of their own worth. When you begin to live truthfully, the kind of love they once draped over you falls away like cheap paint in the rain. It fades so quickly that you realize it had never truly attached itself to you. The only thing that held it in place was your fear of losing it. And when you no longer fear, every invisible rope they use to anchor you to their world becomes useless. They cannot chain a soul that has remembered its freedom. And then the shift becomes visible. The smile that once felt tender tightens into irritation. The warmth that once felt comforting turns into probing questions. The words of love that once melted your heart begin to sound like a list of conditions you are required to meet. They say you have changed, but you have not changed. You simply stopped playing the silent character in your own life. You will see them twist the story, declaring that you are ungrateful, that you do not value love, that you abandoned something beautiful that could have been saved if only you had sacrificed a little more. But you know what that sacrifice meant. It meant turning yourself into a shadow so their light could be seen. They wanted you to dissolve into them so they could feel larger. They wanted you to give up yourself so they could believe they were worth keeping. And when you refuse to do that, they call it a sin. Not because you are wrong, but because you are no longer convenient. In this new clarity, you begin to rediscover the worth of the smallest things you once lost. The natural laughter that needs no permission. The breath that no longer tightens in your chest. The days you walk without feeling measured by someone else's scale. You begin to hear the old rhythm of your soul again. A rhythm that never disappeared, only hid beneath the fear that they would leave if you lived honestly. But the irony is they left the moment you lived honestly, because they never came to meet the real you. They came to meet the version of you they could control. And when that version dissolved, they realized they had no place in the home you were rebuilding. The collapse of false love is not a loss. It is a return. You did not lose a person. You lost an illusion. And in that loss, you reclaimed yourself. You were never the problem. You were simply the first one in this story brave enough to love truly, not by loving someone else, but by loving yourself enough to leave the place where you no longer had room to exist. There are days when you wonder why the love they gave you was so fragile, why it cracked like old glass the moment you tried to stand a little straighter. But then the truth appears clearer than ever. That love was never love at all. It was a rope wrapped in sweet words to make you believe you were kept because of your worth, when in reality you were kept because of convenience. Because if that love had truly been love, it would not have changed its tone every time you stopped obeying. It would not have grown cold the moment you became too free to be led. It would not have disappeared at the exact moment you needed support the most. The truth is, they never wanted to love you. They wanted to own you. They wanted you to warm the room they built from their own insecurity. They wanted you to reflect the image they painted, so they would not have to face the emptiness inside. All the smiles that once softened your heart, all the gentle words that made you believe you were cared for became rewards for your obedience. A kind of love you had to pay for with your silence, with shrinking yourself so no one would be uncomfortable. When affection becomes a transaction, you no longer feel safe. You begin to enter rooms with your chest tight, your mind guessing which role they want you to play today. You do not dare speak too loud, breathe too deeply, or show too much joy or sorrow. Every emotion must pass through an invisible filter. Will this make them leave? Will this disappoint them? Will this make them angry? And while you try to keep them whole, you break apart piece by piece. But one day, when you stop and look at your own exhaustion, something in you rises like a flame that has been smothered too long, no longer willing to be pressed down. You begin to see the moments you once accepted simply because you believed they were the best you could receive. You realize you have lived inside rooms locked by someone else's hesitation. You realize you called their limitations love because you feared that without that name, there would be nothing left to hold on to. And when the light of truth begins to slip into those corners, Psalm 145, verse 18, appears like warm breath inside you. The Lord is near to all who call on him. This verse does not come to comfort you by saying everything will be fine. It comes to remind you that real love never requires you to shrink to survive. Real love never makes you lose your voice. Real love never turns you into an accessory meant to keep someone else from feeling empty inside. Real love comes close without controlling. It lifts rather than weighs down. It frees rather than tightens. And when that truth touches the deepest part of your soul, you understand you never loved wrong. You only gave your heart to people who did not know what to do with a gift, except hold it as proof of their own worth. When you begin to live truthfully, the kind of love they once draped over you falls away like cheap paint in the rain. It fades so quickly that you realize it had never truly attached itself to you. The only thing that held it in place was your fear of losing it. And when you no longer fear, every invisible rope they use to anchor you to their world becomes useless. They cannot chain a soul that has remembered its freedom. And then the shift becomes visible. The smile that once felt tender tightens into irritation. The warmth that once felt comforting turns into probing questions. The words of love that once melted your heart now sound like a list of conditions you are required to meet. They say you have changed, but you have not changed. You simply stopped playing the silent character in your own life. You will see them twist the story, insisting you are ungrateful, that you do not value love, that you walked away from something beautiful that could have been saved if only you had sacrificed a little more. But you know what that sacrifice meant. It meant turning yourself into a shadow so their light could be seen. They wanted you to dissolve into them so they could feel larger. They wanted you to give up yourself so they could believe they were worth keeping. And when you refuse to do that, they call it a sin. Not because you are wrong, but because you are no longer convenient. In this new clarity, you begin to rediscover the worth of the smallest things you once lost. The natural laughter that needs no permission. The breath that no longer tightens in your chest. The days you walk without feeling measured by someone else's scale. You begin to hear the old rhythm of your soul again. A rhythm that never disappeared. only hid beneath the fear that they would leave if you lived honestly. But the irony is they left the moment you lived honestly, because they never came to meet the real you. They came to meet the version of you they could control. And when that version dissolved, they realized they had no place in the home you were rebuilding. The collapse of false love is not a loss. It is a return. You did not lose a person. You lost an illusion. And in that loss, you reclaimed yourself. You were never the problem. You were simply the first one in this story, brave enough to love truly, not by loving someone else, but by loving yourself enough to leave the place where you no longer had room to exist. There are moments in life when truth does not need to speak. It simply stands there, so clear that the ones trying to hide it begin to tremble. That is what happens when you stop being the mirror that reflects the image they want to see. They cannot build their portrait without borrowing your face. They cannot tell their story of greatness unless you stand in the shadows to make them appear brighter. When you step back, the light shines exactly where it should, on them, and what they see is no longer the polished version they once relied on you to reflect. Truth unsettles them not because you have done anything wrong, but because you stopped serving as the witness to the worth they invented for themselves. You were once assigned the role of the guarantor, the one they leaned on to say, "See, I am good, I am right, I am kind." Every time you endured in silence, they pointed to that silence and called it proof of your understanding. Every time you nodded, they called it proof of their wisdom. You were turned into still water for them to see themselves in, but that water never belonged to them. And when that water finally moved with the winds of your own freedom, the image they built shattered on its surface. A strange stillness arrives when the mirror breaks. You no longer have to hold yourself flat so they will not notice the distortion in their own reflection. You no longer have to lift them by lowering yourself to a level your soul could barely breathe in. You stand tall, and in that standing, every empty space they once avoided begins to reveal itself. They call your standing defiance, but in truth, it is simply the first time they are seeing themselves without any layer of paint to hide behind. When that happens, their anger sparks like a flame catching wind, but their anger is not aimed at you. It is aimed at the reflection they are forced to face in the mirror that no longer obeys. You did not break them. You only stopped fixing them by bending yourself out of shape. And that leaves them so confused, they create a new story where they are once again the victim and you are the betrayer. But now, with light shining into the corners, their stories no longer hold together. Others begin to see the cracks you once carried alone in silence. In the moment you feel weakest, a verse from Psalm 119 verse 105 rises like the soft footsteps of light. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. This word does not come to pull you away from truth. It comes to remind you that the path you walk, even covered by accusations and misunderstandings, is still a path of light. You no longer need borrowed light. You no longer need to be a mirror for someone who refuses to face themselves. True light does not shine on pretenses. It shines on what is willing to be revealed. When you stop reflecting them, you begin reflecting yourself. Something beautiful and unfamiliar happens. The parts of you long pressed down begin to rise like a voice finally allowed to speak. You find peace in truth, and that peace threatens those who depend on control. They do not understand how you can be calm without them at the center. But that calm is not victory. It is the return of your soul to its rightful rhythm. Truth does not make you arrogant, it simply returns you to yourself. They begin trying every method to pull you back into the role of the mirror. They try blame to make you feel guilty. They try pity to pull your empathy back toward them. They try chaos to provoke a reaction. But when you no longer participate in the game, every skill they once used to keep you close becomes powerless. You no longer stand where they are used to seeing you. You no longer shrink to be their background. You no longer stay silent to keep peace that never belonged to you, but only kept them from facing themselves. Their confusion is not because you have become distant. It comes from realizing the mirror is broken and cannot be repaired. The pieces at their feet reflect the truth they once fled. In those fragments they see fear, doubt, and insecurity that were once hidden behind the reflection you held up for them. When you stop being the mirror, they lose their final shield, and that exposes them to the world in a way they were never ready for. This breaking is not a loss for you. It is liberation. Liberation from a role you never agreed to. Liberation from the endless expectation that you must protect their image. Liberation from the long nights you wondered why you were never enough. When the truth is that no one is ever enough for an ego that needs others to exist. When the mirror shatters, you see your real face, a face that never needed to be flattened for anyone to look into. And in that light, you understand what your soul has whispered for so long, but you could not hear. You were not born to reflect others. You were born to shine in the way only you can. Those who want to use you as a mirror fear one thing, that your true light will reveal their darkness. And when that happens, they must face a truth no one can hide for them anymore. You were never a piece of glass belonging to anyone. And rising from that role is not betrayal, it is return. Return to your own light, return to your own story, return to the truth they cannot control. There are moments in life when false power collapses, not because anyone exposes it, but because the presence of a true soul leaves it nowhere to cling. That is what happened when you walked into the room without carrying your old fear. You did not do anything unusual. You did not raise your voice. You did not defend yourself. You did not prove anything. You simply stood there as yourself, not bowing, not shrinking, not folding into a smaller version of who you are. And in that instant, the crowns they wore on their heads, crowns cut from paper and painted with glittering gold, began to crack under your light, not because you intended to bring them down, but because real light has never been kind to anything fake. You once thought your calm was something small, yet that calm stripped bare those who relied on the appearance of power. They stood on a high platform only because you stayed small for so long. When you stood tall, that platform suddenly became so low they did not know where to place their feet. No one taught you how to make them smaller. You only returned to your true size, and that return alone was enough to shake them from their self-appointed thrones. They began looking at you with unfamiliar eyes, as if they could not understand how someone once so quiet could now unsettle them so deeply. But that shift did not happen because you grew strong overnight. It happened because they were never as strong as they believed. They stood firm not by real worth, but by your willingness to shrink yourself long enough for them to feel taller. When you no longer did that, the paper crown looked so ridiculous that even they could barely keep it on. While their structures trembled, you felt a new stillness rising inside you, a stillness you once underestimated. It did not come from coldness. It came from truth. And a verse from Psalm 62 verse 1 echoed like a heartbeat, returning to its natural rhythm. My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from Him. This word does not speak of battle. It speaks of foundation, a foundation no false power can reach, a foundation no one can use against you. When your soul is at rest, every noise outside loses its meaning. What makes them tremble is not that you oppose them, it is that you no longer fear them. A person without fear is the most dangerous thing to those who survive by the submission of others. They feel it the moment you walk in. You no longer ask what they want. You no longer look at their eyes to decide your emotions. You no longer rush to calm the storms they create to control the sky inside you. Your calm reveals itself like soft yet sharp light. It does not push anyone down, it simply stands, and that alone makes every shadow shake. They search for explanations. They call you arrogant, even though your voice has not changed. They call you distant, even though you are only protecting your peace. They call you disrespectful, even though you have never once spoken in disrespect. But what they are seeing is not your transformation. They are seeing their own smallness now that the mirror is gone. The false reflection has vanished, and they must see the world through their real eyes, something they never prepared their hearts to do. You can feel their confusion in every gesture. They speak more, yet their words carry no weight. They push harder, yet the pressure falls without touching you. They expect you to tremble like before, but all they see is you exhaling slowly, like someone who has finally laid a burden down. They think they are climbing higher, but in truth, they are only revealing how lost they are now that they cannot enter your mind. You do not need to prove anything. Truth speaks in its own way. True power needs no decoration. It needs no noise. It needs no threat. It needs no audience. It only needs to exist. And when you walk in with that kind of presence, everything built on fear begins to crack. Not because you destroyed it, but because it was already broken, and you finally stopped holding it up. They begin to feel you slipping from their grasp. What they once held now slips through their fingers, silent yet terrifying. They try to pull you back into tangled conversations. They want you to react, to stumble, to return to the familiar shadow you once played. But when you respond with calm or with silence, they feel themselves cutting the air with a dull blade, useless and painful. The truth is, you did not become stronger than they are. You only became yourself. And that is the one thing they cannot control. When you stand in truth, no one can command your breath. No one can place words in your mouth. No one can decide who you must become. You were made to have a voice, not to be the chorus for someone else's ego. One day, you look at them and finally acknowledge what you once feared to admit. They do not fear losing you because they love you. They fear losing you because they lose the only stage where they could stand tall. When you step off that stage, they stand in real light with empty hands, and no paper crown can save them from that reality. You see clearly what they cannot confess. You did not make them smaller. You only stopped making yourself small. Truth stands beside you like an old friend who has been waiting for your return. And now, as you walk in that light, no false power, no accusation, no threat can change this simple truth. You were never meant to belong to the shadows they created. You belong to the light they cannot control. There are moments in life when truth stands between two people like a thin blade, not cutting flesh, but cutting through every illusion they once used to control you. This happens when you choose loyalty to truth over loyalty to the role they want you to play. They are not angry because you did something wrong. They are angry because you are no longer willing to sacrifice your truth to protect their image. And to those who survive on being worshipped, that is the greatest betrayal of all. They never needed you to love them in the pure meaning of love. They only needed you beneath them so they could feel taller. They needed you to agree with things they knew were wrong, just to preserve the polished coating they placed on their own ego. They wanted you silent when truth knocked, wanted you bowed when they were wrong, wanted you smiling while they used you to keep their story from collapsing. You accepted it once, not because you were weak, but because you believed harmony was worth any price. You chose closed eyes to keep the peace, held your breath to keep calm, stepped back to keep the relationship. But slowly you realized that this peace was not peace at all. It was silence bought with your own soul. Then came the day you could no longer stand in that dim place. not because you wanted to fight, but because there was no room left for you to shrink. The truth inside you began to grow like a seed reaching for light, unable to survive the narrow room they built. You did not shout. You did not rebel. You simply stood with truth. But to those who depend on agreement, your truth felt like a direct blow to their illusion. They saw that you were no longer held in their hands, and it made them furious, as if you had broken some sacred rule. So they began to tell a new story, that you were no longer loyal, that you turned your back on them, that you were ungrateful after all they had done. But you knew those words were not aimed at your soul. They were aimed at the emptiness your truth had revealed in them. They did not know how to live without someone bowing to confirm their authority. When you chose truth, you were not the one who changed. They changed because they were forced to stand before a reality with no shield left. They tried to pull you back with guilt. They reminded you of what they had given you, as if their gifts were ropes meant to tie your soul into silence. They spoke of loyalty, but the loyalty they demanded was not loyalty to love or justice or truth. It was loyalty to their ego. They wanted you to say yes when truth was no. They wanted you to nod while your heart wanted to speak. They wanted you to rescue their story by injuring yourself. But truth cannot be smothered, and honesty is never betrayal. You stood with light, and light never requires anyone to bow before darkness. You saw clearly what you once tried not to think about. Loving someone never requires abandoning yourself. You can love, but love never demands that you betray your soul. Anything that asks you to betray yourself is not love. It is control wearing the mask of affection. Truth has a way of shaking whatever is built on fear. When you no longer cooperate with falsehood, their words lose substance. When you no longer nod at what is wrong, they lose support. When you no longer fight truth just to keep them in a high place, they lose the ground beneath them. You did not push them down. They fell on their own when they realized they stood on a surface they never dared to admit was fragile. The irony is that in all their anger, they cannot see how loyal you once were. You were loyal to love, to peace, to the hope that things could be better if you tried a little more. But they wanted a different loyalty. Loyalty to the illusion they built. Loyalty to the story they told. Loyalty to an ego that could never grow without you acting as its shadow. And when you stopped being that shadow, they shrank to their true size. But your loyalty now belongs to truth, not to any person. Truth does not ask you to erase yourself. Truth does not steal your voice. Truth does not turn you into someone who bows. Truth stands beside you the way light stands beside a lamp, not shouting, not forcing, simply illuminating what needs to be seen. And that truth has freed you from invisible commitments you never truly chose. You did not betray anyone. You only stopped betraying yourself. You did not reject them. You rejected a story that did not belong to your soul. You did not hurt them. They were only hurt by the truth they never had the courage to face. The moment you chose truth, the wind changed direction. The accusations no longer stick. The manipulation no longer finds a way in. The shadows they use to keep you small no longer work. You stand tall, and with that, every false story slips from your shoulders like dust. You were never the betrayer. You were the only one brave enough to be loyal to what matters most, loyal to the light. There are things you only recognize once you step out of the darkness they used to hide themselves in. You were never the source of the chaos. You were simply the shadow they pulled in front of them to cover the cracks in their own lives. They were never afraid that you would be wrong. They were afraid that if you stopped standing where every blame could land on you, someone might finally see that the turmoil came from them. and the moment you stopped carrying a burden that was never yours, the curtain they had held up for years fell with it. They were used to living as though you were born to absorb their mistakes. When they acted wrongly, they placed the weight of responsibility on your shoulders. When they lost control, they claimed you caused it. When they hurt others, they shifted the story so all eyes landed on you. They needed a shield, a sacrifice, a container for the things they could not face. And you, with a heart that once believed love meant enduring anything, held all of it without noticing you were being turned into a box for things that did not belong to your soul. There were nights when you wondered if you truly were as wrong as they said, whether you were as terrible as the story they spread. But when silence became your most honest companion, truth rose like morning light. You were not wrong. You were simply near people who needed you as a scapegoat so they would not face themselves. They could not bear the truth that they were the source of the problems they tried to pin on you. And when you stepped out of that role, the truth appeared fully, with no one left to stand between them and the consequences they had avoided. They did not only need you as a hiding place, they needed you as a wall to block others from seeing the holes within them. You once stood there in front of storms they created, in the middle of crises you never started. They called you too sensitive to excuse their emotional volatility. They called you irresponsible to cover the fact that they refused to grow. They said you made things complicated while they built the maze and dragged you inside to guide them through it. When you walked out of that maze, they lost their ability to blame. And losing blame means facing what they have denied for so long. The strange thing is, they are not angry because of anything you did. They are angry because now every gaze is forced to look directly at them. They no longer have the living mirror that was you to reflect the image they wanted the world to believe. They no longer have a large enough shadow to hide behind. They no longer have a story strong enough to wrap around their fear. And in that panic, they try to drag you back into your old role. They try to make you feel guilty, to make you feel responsible for their collapse. But it is not your collapse. It is the collapse of the story they built. When you stop playing the scapegoat, the accusations they threw at you fall from the surface of truth like dust carried off by wind. Those who once listened to their stories begin to sense that something is off, because when you step out and stand in your own calm, no longer reacting the way they expect, no longer explaining, no longer proving, people begin to notice the contrast between your peace and the chaos they create. They see clearly that peace was never what you destroyed. Peace was what they never had. Their panic becomes even clearer when you are silent. No more arguments to twist into evidence against you. No more reactions to use as proof that you are the problem. No more explanations to distort. And in that emptiness, they must finally face themselves. They fear that so deeply they raise their voices, crafting louder stories to fill the void. But loudness cannot cover truth. Loudness only amplifies the weakness they tried to hide in the dark. You stand still, and from that stillness, everything they tried to hide reveals itself. Not through noise, not through confrontation, simply because when light is present, darkness has nowhere left to stay. You did not ruin their reputation. They did that themselves when you stopped standing between them and the results of their actions. Truth does not need a battle to win. It only needs someone to stop hiding it. After many seasons of carrying what was never yours, a deeper realization emerges. You were never loved for who you truly were. You were kept for the function you served in their lives. And when that function ended, they treated you as a problem to discard. But in that very moment, your freedom was born. Freedom does not arrive with shouting. It arrives the moment you set down the weight that never belonged to you and pick up the soul that had been taken too long ago. You finally see what you once feared to believe. They are not angry because you left them. They are angry because you left the role that protected them. You did not cause their downfall. You only stopped holding them up. And when they fell, they tried to call it your fault. But the truth is the opposite. They fell in the story they wrote for themselves. There is no room left for blame, no room left for roles, no room left for hiding. You step out of their shadow, and from the light, the only thing that remains is the truth you once feared, but now fully welcome. You were never the scapegoat. You were simply the proof they did not want to see. Proof that the darkness they feared was not yours. It was theirs. There is a very specific kind of silence known only to those who have been deeply misunderstood. It is a silence not born from a lack of words, but from the realization that there is no reason to keep speaking to those who do not want to hear truth. This silence is not submission. It is a choice. It is the way a soul stands tall without making a sound. And that silence unsettles them more than any explanation you ever gave. They were used to you smoothing over everything. They were used to you explaining things just to rescue what they caused. They were used to seeing you panic when they grew angry, used to watching you fix things you never broke. But when you stopped reacting, they no longer knew where to place their story. The chaos they created suddenly had no anchor. The accusations they hurled at you floated in the air, unable to cling to you anymore. They looked at your silence and mistook it for surrender. But true silence does not resemble surrender. This silence has a spine, it has weight, it has light. It does not avoid, it reveals, it does not bow. It shows that you will no longer fight battles that never belonged to you. And when they realized that, the fear they had been hiding rose to the surface like stirred water. You once did not know silence could be this powerful. You thought silence made you appear weak. But now your silence prevents them from painting you into their narrative. They needed your reactions to maintain the illusion. They needed you to explain yourself so they could twist that effort into evidence you were guilty. They needed your tears so they could use them to look virtuous. But when you remained still, without arguing, without explaining, without stepping into their traps, they were forced to face the true cause of the upheaval, themselves. And when that happened, Psalm 37 verse 4 touched your soul gently. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. This word did not arrive as a promise of possessions. It arrived as a new breath. It reminded you that when your peace rests in a place no one else can take from you, the noise outside loses its power over your heart. It reminded you that real joy is not found in being understood or accepted by those who fear your freedom. Real joy is found in living true to your soul, whether anyone understands it or not. Your silence reveals more than any words ever could. You do not need to enter the battle to win by refusing to participate. You expose the battle for what it truly is: not a pursuit of truth, but a desperate attempt to maintain control. They grow angry not because you are wrong, but because you are no longer the emotional fuel they once used to sustain their dominance. A person who does not react is a person who is no longer controlled. You can feel that shift in the way they speak, the way they glance, the way they attempt to provoke you. Every sentence is crafted for one purpose: to make you react so they can continue the story they know how to tell. But when you refuse to respond, they become lost in the very conversation they built. They ask questions. You stay silent. They accuse. You remain still. They try to corner you. You do not move. And in that stillness, they finally feel something they never allowed themselves to face. The power they thought they had was an illusion fed entirely by your reactions. You are not silent because you are weak. You are silent because your inner strength no longer needs to prove anything. Truth does not require decoration. It does not require combat. It only requires that you stop dimming yourself to protect a false peace. This silence hides nothing. It reveals everything. From afar, others begin to notice the difference. They see you steady while the other person unravels. They see you calm while the other person scrambles. They see you grounded while the other person crafts new narratives every day. Your silence highlights their noise. Your gentleness highlights their chaos. And those who once believed their story tilt their heads and wonder, if you were truly the problem, why are you lost to the one at peace? That is the moment truth opens the eyes of the observers. You do not need to explain anything. Truth explains itself by letting everything false collapse once you stop supporting it. Anyone paying attention feels the imbalance. The silence of the innocent and the noise of the frightened always speak louder than any accusation. And then, looking back, you realize your silence did not only free you from them, it freed you from your former self, the self who thought you had to fix everything. Carry every blame, calm every storm, keep everyone happy. That version of you was exhausted, and now it has finally been laid to rest. In this new stillness, you find yourself again, not the self shaped by pain or endurance, but the self shaped by light, a light that is not loud or dazzling for attention, but warm enough to tell you that you are finally on the right path. This silence has become the strongest declaration of your life. I am no longer controlled. You were never the problem. You were simply the first one brave enough to walk away from a conversation designed to make you doubt yourself. And once you left, that conversation lost its power to exist. There is a moment on this journey no one can describe to you beforehand. A moment so gentle that if you are not paying attention, you might think you simply took a deep breath and kept walking, but it is not an ordinary breath. It is the first breath of a soul no longer held by invisible chains. No sound, no fireworks, no bursting emotion. Just a quiet, luminous stillness where you understand, through pure intuition, that you have stepped through a doorway others once tried to keep you from crossing. You enter freedom the way someone steps out of a cramped room they lived in for so long, they forgot how wide the sky used to be. You are not running away, and you are not trying to prove anything. You are simply returning to the truth of yourself. That lightness makes you realize how shallow your breathing once was, how small you had made yourself, how hard you worked to fit into a shape they designed for you. And now that you are no longer in that shape, you feel the space within you expand in a way it never has before. What they fear most is not your leaving. What they fear is your standing free without needing their permission. They were used to seeing you strain to keep the peace. They were used to seeing you blame yourself to keep their world from collapsing. They were used to hearing the tremble in your voice whenever their mood shifted. But when you begin walking with this new calm, they realize the thing they relied on to maintain their power has vanished: your fear. This freedom does not come from confrontation, it comes from truth. And in that moment, the words of Psalm 27 verse 1 become clear as still water. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? This does not promise a life without trials. It simply says fear no longer gets to take your hand and lead you anywhere it wants. It reminds you that light does not need to defeat anything to exist. It simply shines. And that is exactly what you are doing. When you live in freedom, your eyes change. They no longer dart away. They no longer search for permission in the reactions of others. Your gaze becomes something they cannot control, and that is what frightens them. No one can hold a soul that has discovered its own worth. Those who once called you the problem begin to see their story losing its audience. The accusations they used to keep you inside their fence suddenly echo hollow. People watching from the outside start to see what you knew for so long but did not dare admit. You were never the cause. You were only the place where they unloaded what they refused to face. And when you are no longer there to catch it, everything they hid spills into view. You do not wish them harm. You do not seek revenge. Freedom does not need revenge. Freedom only needs you to walk forward without carrying what is not yours. They collapse not because of you. They collapse because truth is no longer hidden. And you, in the quiet of your renewed soul, finally have the courage to say what you never could before. You deserve to live in light, not in someone else's shadow. You begin rebuilding your life without using the broken bricks of fear. You speak words you once swallowed. You step through doors you once believed were not meant for you. You find joy that needs no conditions, laughter that needs no permission, meaning that comes from the path itself, not from anyone's approval. You need no warning, you need no confirmation, you only need to continue. As you walk deeper into this journey, Psalm 34 verse 19 echoes in your heart like a gentle but powerful reminder. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all. This does not mean you are spared from storms. It means the storms cannot consume you. Deliverance is not escaping the storm. It is standing in it without losing who you are, and that you have already done. You once thought freedom meant cutting things off. Now you understand true freedom is being strong enough to keep what belongs to you and release what does not. No one taught you this. Pain taught you. Silence taught you. Truth taught you. And now, as you look back on the past, your heart no longer trembles. You do not resent. You do not regret. You simply know that without those days, you would never have discovered the depth of your own soul. Freedom changes the way you see the world. You are no longer swayed by those who hide their fear behind the mask of power. You no longer confuse convenience with kindness. You no longer mistake control for love. You no longer believe that peace achieved by silencing yourself is real peace. You have tasted truth, and truth cannot be forgotten. And then, as you stand in this space, the space of a soul finally aligned with its true rhythm, the number 111 appears like a mark of a new chapter, not some mystical omen, but a reminder that new beginnings do not come from outside. They begin the moment you choose truth. 111 becomes the doorway that opens when you stop staying where your soul cannot breathe. If someone listening feels this number touch them like a quiet call, let it appear in your sharing not as a ritual, but as confirmation that your soul is beginning its own chapter. This journey is not about proving they were wrong. This journey is about proving you are free. And that freedom will continue to lead you to places you once believed you were unworthy to enter. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It guides you gently, like the first breath after a window is opened. And looking back at the whole story, you understand that what frightened them was never your flaws. What frightened them was losing the ability to control you. And as you walk away from all of that, your steps grow lighter, your heart grows brighter, and your soul knows one truth no one can take from you. You were never the problem. You are the evidence that true freedom cannot be silenced.
Grateful that you chose to spend these moments in the light of this story. If it touched your soul, please like, share, and subscribe, and ring the bell so the next whisper of light may find its way back to you.